The bell above the diner's door jingled like a small apology. The same afternoon the sky wore its tired, late winter grey. The place smelled of coffee that had been kept warm too long and buttered toast, of grease and the soft musk of a town that had seen better mornings. A handful of regulars hunched over counters and newspapers, chewing slowly, as if digestion itself was a kind of prayer. She sat in the corner booth by the window, the woman everyone called Miss Lillian, though some used louder, more familiar names. Her hair was silver and gathered into a careful knot, hands folded on a cardigan that had seen winters and weddings. The walker she relied on leaned against the table like an old friend. She was small, as many grandmothers are, small, fierce, and full of the kind of peace that comes from surviving things that would have broken other people. They came in as a storm of laughter and cheap bravado. 5 of them, ages hard to judge at first glance, late teens, early 20s, suits of swagger and bravado. One had a jacket with a logo that meant nothing to the town but everything to him. Another chewed gum so loud it sounded like an extra heartbeat. They flung themselves into a booth and claimed the jukebox with their voices. The diner's hum adjusted itself around them, like a concert hall accommodating too many trumpets. Miss Lillian watched them, not with fear but with the wary attention of someone who'd learned to read small changes in posture. She had seen kids like that before, their mouths full of stories about how they would not be caught, how their names would roll off the backs of envelopes and into bigger rooms. She sipped her coffee. She remembered another time when such laughter had been her own son's, thin and brave. "Watch your mouths in here," called the cook from behind the counter, a wiry man with a voice like gravel. He kept the peace mostly with glances and with his hands on the griddle. This diner had rules older than the menu. Respect was one of them. They ignored him. One of the boys noticed Miss Lillian's walker and, with the kind of cruel curiosity that loves small, vulnerable things, knocked at the rubber tip with his heel. The noise was a petty percussion meant to startle. Miss Lillian looked up slowly, the lines at the corners of her eyes folding like soft paper. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice the valley between a prayer and a reprimand. "It's all right," she said, and there was a steadiness there that was not weakness. "Just keep your feet, baby." The boy laughed and reached forward, fingers searching for the bottom of her handbag. Fingers that weren't used to being told no. The handle slipped. Her purse fell to the floor with the soft, humiliating sound of a life being jostled. Receipts fanned like sobs. Coins rolled away. "Hey!" cried the waitress, moving faster than the town's gossip. She was young and practiced at being the eyes of the place. "Leave her alone." One of the 5 pushed their chair out roughly. "Mind your business," he said, the kind of voice that believes volume is law. He stepped close and shoved Miss Lillian hard enough that her walker rocked. Her hand, thin and veined, gripped the table. The grin on his face was the grin of someone who has been given permission to be cruel and intends to take full advantage. Then something in the room shifted. Maybe it was the way she took a breath. Maybe it was the way her eyes searched the door, as if expecting someone who had been late to supper for 40 years. The jukebox hummed out of tune. Conversation scraped to a halt. The air condensed, like before a thunderclap. "That's enough," someone said, so quietly that it might have been part of the building itself. The 5 boys turned as one toward the entrance. They expected a frazzled owner, a cook with a spatula, maybe a sheriff with a soft badge. What they saw didn't match any of their expectations. He walked in slow and steady, as if moving through water that wanted to keep him. He pushed the door with a cane, the kind with a metal tip worn smooth by countless sidewalks. He was not a young man. He was thicker now, weathered, with hair cut close, and a scar that ran from his temple to the cheekbone like a memory carved in flesh. There was something about his shape, broad shoulders beneath a jacket that had clearly seen both storms and better days, that made people in the room sit up straighter. He was Miss Lillian's son. They remembered him as a boy, maybe. They remembered the picnic by the river, the way his laugh used to split light in two, the times he'd tied broken things back together. Some of the older regulars had watched him grow up as if he were their own. But they had not seen the years when he had been elsewhere. They had not been there while he learned the names of places that break men and then make them again. The town kept its history in small jars. The sons and daughters who left were stories the town told at church potlucks, with triumphs and with apologies. He moved like a man who had been taught how to step where danger used to live. Something about the way he held the cane, crooked, precise, made the young men in the booth glance at each other. It was the look of prey finally seeing a shadow they know belongs to their own hunter. "Son," Miss Lillian said, and her voice folded into his like a map finding its path. There was an old warmth. He smiled, and beneath it was the memory of lullabies and scraped knees and the smell of Sunday dinners. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked right up to the table as if he'd been walking there his whole life. The boys went still, and in that stillness their laughter broke and scattered. "Leave her purse," he said, and his voice made the word into a demand and a promise. There was absolutely nothing theatrical about him. His hands were the hands of someone used to repair work, knuckles thick, careful. The cane rested against his thigh. One of them shrugged like an apology. "Man, she had cash," he said, trying to smuggle bravado back into his posture. "You heard him," the second said, but the second's jaw was moving under a thin skin of fear. He knew the man in front of him was not the sort who took being flouted lightly. There were notes in the way the son exhaled, the tight control of someone who had been taught to contain things until the right moment. "Walk away. Make us," the leader sneered. Boldness often hides a panic. His smile was a thin slip of paper. The others laughed, but it sounded like wind in a poorly shuttered house. The son looked at Miss Lillian, a quick glance. No theatrics, just presence. "You good, Ma?" he asked, and she nodded. She was small but steady. Then the leader lunged, not at her, but at the son, like the challenge had shifted to the new, larger body in the room. He shoved his shoulder, a foolish, adrenaline-heavy push. The son took the force and folded it into the cane, pivoting, not like a man taken by surprise, but like someone who had practiced welcome and rebuke in equal measure. For a heartbeat, the diner was a held breath. Someone dropped a sugar packet. The jukebox skipped. The son caught the boy's arm with a movement that was soft and necessary, and the leader found himself off balance on a floor he hadn't been told wasn't his. He stumbled into a booth and hit the table. Hot coffee shivered in its cup. The room seemed to exhale. "That's not the way to treat a woman who made you a sandwich in this town," the son said, and there was a coolness to him that was not anger but something closer to authority. Authority is a curious thing. It asks for nothing and expects everything. The five of them had bought their authority by volume and velocity, not by presence. The leader scrambled back to his feet. "You gonna step on us?" he dared, but his voice had thinned out the edge. The others shifted. The grin had evaporated from their faces. "Nobody wants trouble," the cook said, wiping the spatula with a motion that said he'd rather not be in the wrong place when history decided to happen. The sheriff, a wiry man with tired eyes who had been sipping coffee by the window, set his cup down and watched with an expression that measured what would be and what should be. The leader's hand went for his phone like a reflex, probably to call friends, probably to record something that would make him bigger. But his fingers hesitated. In the battered silver ring on the son's hand, sun and store lights played. The ring had the kind of wear that spoke of a man who carried vows, not trophies. "You leave now," the son said. "All of you. Don't come back. This is not a place for this." The word came like a law. They looked at one another and, in their thin, young way, decided to retreat. Fear scatters tribes. One rose, another followed, shame and fear joining like weather to push them out the door. They spilled into the street, their laughter gone. The bell above the door rang once more, and then fell silent as footsteps carried a different rhythm into the town. They did not run far. The sheriff still watched, and people in the street whispered. The leader's shoulders hunched as if he carried more than he could bear. The son watched them leave with a tilt to his head, as if listening to what the town needed to say to those who would learn by being stopped. After the door closed, the room exhaled slowly, a collective softening. The young waitress wiped her hands on her apron and took Miss Lillian's purse, setting it on the table as if making restitution. The coins had stopped rolling by themselves. The regulars returned to their papers in small fits. Life in these towns is a sequence of small recoveries after tremors. Miss Lillian reached across the table and took her son's hand. Her fingers were like old roots, knotted and sure. "You came," she said simply. He smiled like someone who had come to be company to the ordinary. "Said I'd be here by 3, he answered. "You always liked the pie." "Best pie this side of the river," she agreed. "Even after all those years teaching you pride, you come back for apple." They both laughed softly, the kind of sound that has a small, private history. Around them the diner performed its slow, humble rituals. Coffee was offered, refilled, accepted. Conversation thawed and turned to other things. Baseball scores, the price of eggs, the way the snow had waited too long this season. The incident became a punctuation mark, something to be noted and tucked into the town's memory. Later, when the sheriff took a statement and the young men were politely but firmly given to the county for further conversation, the son stood aside and let the law do its part. He had learned, through years that had taught him both patience and precision, that justice lay at itself, sometimes immediate, sometimes formal, but always most durable when the community's channels held. "Don't let them think they can do that to you," a young man in a flannel shirt told Miss Lillian later, as if expressing what everyone felt. "You shouldn't have to." Miss Lillian patted his hand with the air of someone mending a torn shirt. "Child," she said, looking at the son and then back at the boy, "people learn patience in different ways. Let them learn." They left the diner that evening slowly, the son supporting his mother gently with a cane between them like a third party in the walk. Outside, the sky had untangled itself into a thin, clean blue. The street smelled of oil and cold air and a hint of thaw. A neighbor waved from his porch. The world, imperfect and stubborn, turned a small, brighter corner. As they walked she told him about the pie recipe she had been fiddling with, about a stray cat she had fed that morning, about the neighbor who played the violin too loud on Sundays. He listened the way sons sometimes do when they are home and the work of the world is, for the moment, set aside. "You know," he said at one point, "I didn't come back because I thought I had to be anyone. I came back because of the smell of this place. The same smells in my dreams." She squeezed his hand. "That's why you always belonged here," she said. "No other place did you that way." He had been changed by what he'd seen outside the town, a world that had carved him into edges and then taught him how to soften them. He had learned how to be brave without showing it like a prize. The thugs had seen only the surface. They couldn't feel the years behind his smile. They couldn't know the hours spent learning how to protect what mattered without making a spectacle. Back in the diner, life resumed its modest, grand choreography. The cook plated a piece of pie on the house for Miss Lillian and her son. The regulars nodded in a quiet way that said more than words. Even the jukebox, having paused for a small life lesson, spun back into song. Word of it spread, as it always does. By nods, by shared coffee, by truthful gossip that loses nothing in the telling. The town would tell the story not as a thing of a single instant of violence or threat, but as the day the town remembered how to keep one another safe again. And somewhere down the road, the five who had come in with brash laughter found themselves sitting in a room answering questions and looking, for the first time, at the faces of people who held them accountable. The leader's smirk had been replaced by a face that knew the quiet, heavy price of being seen. It was not a miracle. It was the slow, ordinary miracle of consequence catching up to arrogance. Miss Lillian and her son left the diner that evening, not as two people who had been saved from danger, but as a mother and a son who had walked into a small, ordinary victory. They walked with the knowledge that the world had shifted a few degrees toward kindness. For the son, who had carried harshness and tenderness in equal measure, it felt like an appropriate trade. In the weeks that followed, the diner hummed a little differently. People paused a little longer to listen to one another. Children who had once thought toughness was a badge began to learn other badges, the ones that said respect, that said responsibility. Miss Lillian kept making pie. Her son joined the community meetings and listened with the patience of someone who knew that rebuilding was a quiet, relentless thing. Sometimes that is all it takes. A presence that asks for dignity and a town that remembers how to give it. The five who had rushed and learned, by way of small, slow justice, that the world is full of lines you do not cross without paying. Miss Lillian kept her purse in her lap after that, not because she feared theft, but because she had been reminded that her life belonged to her alone. On a bright morning a month later, as the son stood by the register paying for coffee, a kid walked in, looked around, and asked quietly, "Is that the man who told those fools to get out?" The son smiled, the kind that bends the teeth in a soft, honest arc. "Yeah," he said. "That's me. But don't make me a story. I'm just a man who came home to his mother's pie." The kid laughed, and the town listened. Outside, the street hummed with the ordinary machinery of life. Cars, dogs, a woman sweeping her stoop. The world did not become perfect. It never would. But somewhere between the kitchen's clang and the bell on the door, between the coffee steam and the pie, a small, enduring truth settled into place. When someone stands for another, sometimes people who forget how to be kind remember again.